Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. It's all about introducing PIA, transforming process improvement with generative AI. It's so great to have you with us today. So you'll notice that everyone's muted, but feel free to submit any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom, and the recording will be sent out to you tomorrow. So if you miss anything or want to catch up, you can get that tomorrow. So today's speaker is the wonderful Ira, who's going to be taking you through PIA. So over to you, Ira.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining today. Super excited to share with you what we're doing with generative AI and PIA. So today's agenda, we're going to have a brief introduction. We want to talk a little bit about the transformation drivers, like why PIA? How are we leveraging generative AI technology to solve real business problems for customers? Want to talk a little bit about, process improvements and, the barrier to entry. Then we'll introduce PIA. We'll have a live demonstration, which I'm really excited about. We'll talk about the existing capabilities, what's on, kind of our near-term roadmap and what is our vision for PIA in generative AI. Then we'll talk a little bit about how to get started using PIA. And then last, we'll have a Q&A session. We typically find these very interactive and lively, so super excited to hear what questions you have and learn a little bit about the from the audience of how you think about this technology solving business problems for you. So let's talk a little bit about transformation drivers. Why did we develop PIA? What are we attempting to solve with this technology? Well, it really starts with transformation drivers. How do we improve productivity, reduce cost while ensuring compliance? Most of our customers in the market are, regulated in some aspect. Compliance is a key component. So when we think about compliance in generative AI technology, how do those overlap and how do we, as we deliver feature functionality and solve business problems for you, ensure that compliance? Then it becomes a little bit more about continuous improvement and doing more with less. When we think about, process information in where does that live? It lives in systems, it lives in documentation, it lives in, the minds of your employees. Oftentimes, people know what they do every day, but they couldn't necessarily describe for you what their process is. One of the challenges with transformation efforts is really getting participation from the organization to help document what's happening. Then from the other side of that, you do have systems, process mining, task mining that can also bring process-related information and data into kind of that ecosystem. So what is our approach? What's the Process 360 Live approach to transformation? It's really about, gaining an objective visibility into how your processes run in reality. A lot of times you'll document processes, but there might be variance changes in how that process is conducted. Things that either create waste and inefficiency or create efficiencies, and you don't necessarily know that are documented. By allowing more people to contribute to the process landscape, you uncover these inefficiencies, bottlenecks, and opportunities for improvement. You uncover failure points and implemented controls. So you want to build an ideal risk-informed future state collaboratively. That means getting more people to contribute. Most of the folks that we deal with, you have some sort of kind of central area of the business that's responsible for process. And one of the key challenges is really getting folks to contribute to that process landscape in a way that's risk-informed and compliant. And then lastly, it's about, how do you optimize your processes and close the gaps, right? So PIA, specifically, we're looking at it is how do we leverage this technology to help you and provide insights and operational intelligence based on your data and your processes. So process improvement, barriers to entry, it's time consuming, right? Most employees in your organization probably, are not familiar with BPMN or other, frameworks, specifications. And if you ask them, hey, I want you to be able to diagram what it is you do for the organization. That's a big barrier to entry for non-technical employees. You may have somebody that is in a non-technical role in your organization, and they need to be able to document their process and contribute to this process landscape. That is a significant challenge with organizations. Because in most cases, there's focus groups, workshops, and ways that you're trying to uncover this. Wouldn't it be great if these folks can contribute directly? And that really solves, to a degree, some of the lack of ownership that we see, in these process improvement and transformation initiatives. Everybody has to feel a sense of ownership in what it is and the work that they do. So how can PIA help you overcome these challenges? So generative AI powered assistant, it's designed to turn natural language conversations and standard, SOP documents into fully functional process diagrams. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pivot and get to the fun part, which is the actual live demonstration of PIA. But before we get started, directly, I want to talk a little bit about what you're going to see today. We're going to really talk a little bit about, if I'm an employee and I simply want to document what I do, how would I go about doing that? How can I potentially also leverage PIA to uncover things that I might want to do to improve my process, and then interface with the business to actually get that updated? So we're going to start with just a really simple process of, what do I do all day? And this is really somebody who works, for Pete's Coffee, and they are essentially the shipping and receiving manager. They have a staff of 3. And so the idea here is that this employee is going to tell PIA what they do all day. So you'll notice here, when I go into add a new diagram, I have a different diagram type that I can use to create. And that is leveraging PIA to actually create the diagram versus a traditional diagram editing canvas. So you'll see here what happens when I initiate a conversation with PIA is I'm sent to basically a blank canvas in a preview, and I'm given the opportunity to provide a prompt. So in this case, I'm going to provide this prompt that is basically just me writing out what I do. Small correction, although PIA wouldn't care. And then you'll see here, I prompt PIA, giving PIA the information of what I do. Any employee in your organization can write and document what they do. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a completely structured manner in which the process document steps have to be ideal. PIA is smart enough to uncover some of that nuance and make some of these corrections on the fly. So I think it's really important to talk about what just happened, right? So PIA took our prompt in the information, and it basically outlined the steps that I have described and created a process diagram based on those steps. Now, the interesting thing here is that, maybe I'm missing something. And in this particular case, I think, we are missing something. We are not, for example, doing verifications and checks as part of the process. We're not doing an order verification or check, for example. So I want to update this process. See, happens when I type and I don't look at my screen. So let's say update to include steps for order and shipping validation. So I can actually interact and have an iterative conversation with PIA to update what I do on a day-to-day basis, and provide basically the business with some context in the activities and the processes that I'm involved in. And so PIA is going to update this, and it is going to add steps for order validation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to save this because right now this is very important. And I know that this is going to come up in the Q&A because it always does. How does this conversation actually work? How does this happen? How do we isolate and separate conversations between, customers in a, kind of large language model environment? So every conversation that you initiate with Pia in this preview mode is a one-to-one conversation between you and the Pia service, essentially. And so there's no data, that's crossing over with other customers. We are not leveraging at this point any data within your repository to inform Pia. That is something that we'll talk about later as we talk about what's coming next, as part of our plans in the roadmap. But it's extraordinarily important because many organizations have, data security and other concerns with generative AI technology. And we've implemented this in a way that is extraordinarily low risk for organizations. And so I've updated the process. I can do a number of things here. In the number of things I can do, I can change the language associated. I can add colors. I can add context to this diagram, and I can make these iterative updates. So it's not just about the diagram, it's also about the iterative updates and formatting that you can do as well. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save this. And you'll see when I save this, I actually have the diagram now. So you might ask, like, what's the next step? Great. Somebody in my organization has created basically a diagram that describes what they do. This is not ready to be included in your repository and associated with your business architecture at this stage. This is ready for somebody in your organization to review this and to consider, where this might, fit within your organization in your process landscape. Now, one way that you can manage this is really, leveraging our cycle management and governance process to be able to have somebody actually take a look at what was just created. So I can, for example, create a review cycle. And this review cycle is the people who need to review PIA diagrams. So I've created this review cycle. I will save this. I will start this cycle. And now the individuals listed in that can now go in and they can actually see what I've created for organizational alignment. There's going to be additional work to do to connect this to your business architecture at this point, right? So you have check order system. You probably have a process that you want to link or describe here. That might be something more suited for, kind of your process designers and process architects at this point. However, you've got a starting point. Now, if you ask this employee to draw this, it might take an extraordinary amount of time to do that. So we, on average, have kind of pulled, it takes, for a, standard complexity, process, it takes roughly an hour to diagram that. So when we talk about, achieving significant reduction in the time spent, we're really talking about this initial diagram creation phase that takes generally around an hour to document. And then at that point, you need to connect it to your business architecture. We're giving, employees without technical expertise a significant advantage in actually creating initial diagrams for your organization to be able to review and adopt into your enterprise architecture. So we've just created this process, and this is what I do, and we've set it out for somebody to kind of take a look and say, hey, I want to take action on this. And I want to actually, leverage this as part of, maybe this is a, level 6 process, level 5 process. I want to actually include this within my process architecture. But that's not all, that P is capable of, right? We start to talk about how do we actually give you insights into how you might improve your process or give you process intelligence insights. And part of that is P is also capable, and we'll go ahead and do this now, of actually helping you create information on where you might make general improvements. So here we're going to initiate another conversation. Whoop! Looks like I picked the wrong object type. We're going to go back here. We'll add the object diagram, PIA conversation. We'll open it back up. So I prompted Pia, create the perfect process for shipping coffee orders for a staff of 3 people. Now, one of the interesting things about Pia and generative AI in general is really around the idea of the prompt. The prompt is extraordinarily important when determining the outcome or the answer that you're going to get from Pia or generative AI in general. Um, You'll often find if you use ChatGPT, there's this iterative process of refining how you ask questions to get a better answer. And here you see, what Pia did was actually construct what it considers the perfect process for actually shipping coffee. Now, there's some things that you'll notice that are decidedly different between what the employee typed for what they do and what Pia actually constructed as the perfect process. So now we're starting to get into, kind of the idea that we can identify where there might be areas for improvement. And so, the next step is, right now you can kind of manually take a look at that and say, hey, do we do all of these things? Do we, validate, for example, when we get an order that, that's actually the correct order? Do we have validations checks in place, as part of our, shipping process for quality, ensuring that, we have proper addresses, those sorts of things. And so what happens is you start to uncover that there might be gaps in our process and how we can iterate. So that begins, kind of really the more simple use cases around PIA and generative AI in general. We get into much more complex ones. Many of our customers and folks in the market have, complex processes, complex SOP documents that they create. And here, what you're taking a look at is just a document, I created around a product development process. So how do you build products, traditionally? And so as you can see here, you can actually use a prompt to actually create the SOP that you then later want to ingest, or you can do both, somewhat at once. However, there's a distinction right now in how the information is formatted. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But here we have create a process for creating Jira stories as a product manager. And so we've gone through and we've basically captured everything that we would do here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go over to Pia. I'm going to initiate another conversation. Here. And basically what I've done is just pasted the information from the SOP into the chat. You can upload it as a document. You can just paste the text directly. And we'll see here. Pia is actually going to go out based on this SOP from a product development process and is actually going to construct the diagram. Now, keep in mind that there are folks in your organization, again, that conduct activities, execute on processes. They know what they do every day. And there's a wealth of knowledge in your organization if you can just give folks a way to actually contribute. So you can see here that Pia actually constructed the product development process. It's gone through and it's actually identified all the areas of responsibility, who's responsible for what. Now there's a few interesting things here. These probably don't exist as resources in your organization that you're going to link these to, right? So there is, again, kind of this concept that I've given you a starting point. I've given that initial starting point. I've created the diagram. It's taken me seconds to actually execute on this. I could then send this off for review in broader organizational alignment. So we're going to go ahead and just discard this conversation. We'll go back over here. We want to talk a little bit about iterative conversations and making updates and changes, kind of leveraging PIA. You do have the ability to have this ongoing conversation. You also have the ability, within, kind of the SOPs themselves, right, to actually go through and document. Let's see here. We're going to paste this in. You can actually document additional steps, notes in your SOP documents to actually change the results. Oh, there we go again. Click the wrong button. Let's try this again. Diagram, pick PIA this time. So here we're going to initiate a conversation based on that initial prompt. And you'll notice that it's going to create a different diagram based on this prompt than it created when I pasted in the SOP, documentation itself. So this is, the reason I'm highlighting this is this shows kind of the nature of the evolving conversation that you can have over, in the refinement that can happen. So here we've created this. This looks interesting. Probably not ideal, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take these steps that have actually been created here, and I'm just going to copy those. And to give you an idea of what that might look like on a broader scale, as we take this conversation that is nothing but unformatted data from an SOP, we're going to take this one, we're going to create another one using this text. Paste that in. It's funny because as P is working behind the scenes, I just want to show this would make no sense, to a human being trying to read this. However, it is decidedly not any different than this. And so it's actually been formatted. And the reason that I bring this up is different, organizations, different businesses, different departments have a different way that they actually document what they do. And in what matters is that you actually have some sort of a logical construction or an order to what it is that you do. How it's actually documented doesn't matter as much. We can take and ingest many different document types in order to produce initial results. And then you can have an iterative conversation. Well, sometimes PIA doesn't know what I'm asking. And sometimes you try again. And so as you have this data, as you have this structured information in your organization, different SOP types, different formatting, some things that we want to note as far as, capabilities. So, PIA can certainly, look at text, unstructured data. It does not have the capability today to look at images. Now, we want to talk a little bit more about generative AI technology and how we're actually leveraging that within PIA. Think about it, there's really two different, technology tracks. There's generative AI on its own that is increasing in capability. There are enhancements that are happening. And then there's iGrafx and how we're leveraging, those innovations to solve business problems for customers. And so we are looking at, image ingestion. But generative AI in general has a challenge right now of if you have, a document or SOP and it contains text and images, it has a difficult time parsing both of those at the same time in a document. So that's not a PIA challenge, that's a generative AI challenge. This also comes in with video, audio. We certainly expect that, generative AI is going to increase and these capabilities are going to be available for us to leverage as part of PIA. So here you see, we tried again, and yes, PIA actually created the structured, diagram based on this blob of text, essentially. So we want to talk a little bit more about, kind of complexity and some of the things that, we're thinking about from a complexity standpoint. Because we can get in here and talk about, here we have an accounts receivable process. And you can see, this is probably more nearly represents most of the SOP type documentation that we see in customer organizations. Here you have tables, you have images that represent application screens. This is an accounts receivable process. So here we have, what's the prompt that I'm going to use to actually create a process from this document? So we're actually going to just tell it to create a process from the file. Select PIA. Create a process from the file. Be sure to scan tables for data. We'll attach the document, and then we'll hit go. So you'll see it's going to take this prompt, and essentially it's going to ingest it much like you would copy and paste the text. Really, we see document ingestion as a real clear-cut way to actually get information in. But if you have a document and paste the text, you can do that as well. You can have a document, you can ingest it. Maybe you're missing a step. You can actually go back to the SOP, add it, refine it, re-ingest it, create the diagram. So PIA, traditionally, the prompts when we're doing the diagram generation takes about 30 seconds. Updates as well, take 15, 30 seconds. We are looking to change and update, basically, yeah, I didn't like the way that this one came out. Let's try it again. Let's go over here and take a look at how that might have changed. So we've got our accounts receivable process. It looks somewhat similar. So some things that I want to talk about, on near-term improvements. You'll notice, right, text overlapping. We do have the capability to auto-size text, but PIA is not leveraging that yet. So we are going to be doing that. So we want the final product to actually look better. The other thing that you note is that PIA will send quite a bit of information into associated notes here. And so we're looking at increasing the capability of PIA to handle complexity. Right now, it does handle significant complexity, which we'll show here in a moment. But we want to handle it better. We want it to be able to adapt to various frameworks we'll talk about in a moment. And then we want it to be able to handle more, complex decisions, complex, gateways. So let's talk a little bit about, that level of complexity in where we're kind of headed. So we've talked about the accounts receivable process. Here we've documented basically an order to cash process, based on APQC framework. And so when we take a look at the prompt itself, create an order to cash process for a global bank that follows the APQC framework. Make sure to account for differing regulatory landscapes in North America and EMEA. Ensure to list who's responsible and accountable for what processes and activities. So that's the prompt leverage to actually generate the process. And part of the reason is we have to generate these documents and simulate, what customers and what would be in the market. We can't use any documentation, that we have. We have to create it net new. So we use the prompt to create the process and the framework. And you can see here in North America, here are the regulatory, guidance and concerns. What are the things that we have to adhere to. And so we can go through here and we can see, it's pretty detailed at a high level. And when we go over to PIA and we prompt PIA, we'll get into it. You can see here, it creates basically a standardized, process. So some interesting things you will note, because PIA needs some additional capability for complex gateways. Most of the complexity starts to look a little bit like a staircase, and so that is something that we're looking at in looking at solving fairly near term. But you can see that's one area of complexity, and I want to talk a little bit about another area of complexity. So this is a prompt. What is the process pharmaceutical companies use to bring products to market? And it created a very, very robust, set of guidance for that. And then how does that actually manifest, you know, as a prompt? It's significant, right? So we have a very large diagram that is probably not easy to understand. So as we get into the complexity, it becomes more important that PIA is able to handle a little bit more of the complexity with gateways and with areas of responsibility. And so here we look a significant, significantly large diagram that again looks a bit like a staircase. Here we see we have an activity, post-market safety monitoring. So we said, what would that process look like? And so here we have a prompt. I'm an employee who's responsible for post-market safety monitoring. Can you provide me my process and associated activities for the role? And so there's this concept that people know what they do. There's this concept that generative AI can kind of pick out and start to surface, maybe best practices, other information. And now it becomes about overlaying and aligning those so we can actually start to surface operational insights, areas of improvement, maybe areas where there might be gaps. So this gets into a little bit more of where we're heading. So right now, your employees, all of them, even your non-technical folks, can go in and actually contribute to your enterprise architecture and your process landscape. They can do that today. You have a way to funnel that information into a group that can review that for alignment. This will save those folks in an enormous amount of time of you uncovering and discovering what people are doing in your organization. So here we have the post-monitoring safety process. And this is just another level of the process. And we can see here, constructed much the same. So, in today's world, your individual responsible for this process might document it. They might type out an SOP or a document of what they do that they want to send to, kind of your process org, process excellence organization. And then you might, kind of want to ingest this and actually take action. And so what happens is once these initial diagrams are created from these employees that ordinarily wouldn't have the technical expertise to create them, you can then go in, obviously, you can check these out. Your designers, your architects, the other individuals in your organization, with the expertise can actually go in, create the describes, relationships, et cetera. So that's what we have right now today. And with that, what I would like to do is open it up for any specific questions on what you've seen so far. And then I want to, get into a little bit more about where are we going with this technology.
That was great, Ira. So yeah, if you have any questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. We've got one question at the minute, Ira, which says, does PIA create L3 process maps and does it use BPMN 2.0?
So PIA will create any process maps. So any level process map that you'd create, it's about what is the information you're giving PIA and what is the question that you're asking PIA. So you can absolutely do that. Can you repeat the second part of that question for me?
Of course. So the first part, which you answered, does PIA create L3 process maps and does it use BPMN 2.0?
I would say loosely yes, but not not in an ideal way to date. So one thing interesting to note is that PIA itself couldn't actually draw a diagram. Generative AI would have no idea how to actually execute that in iGrafx. So what we had to do was essentially build and leverage an engine that is leveraged for diagram creation, which PIA uses. So the next set of enhancement for that better fidelity and to get more diagrams that are a little bit more organized, how customers create them and not necessarily this complex staircase, the engine needs to be updated so PIA can actually leverage that. So it's actually not a PIA innovation or change that needs to happen. PIA is more than capable right now. It's the underlying engine that PIA is using to actually create the diagram in iGrafx.
Okay, we've got another question. Can you add peer to an existing process map?
No, not today. And part of the reason why is really thinking through, right? How do we actually roll out this technology to customer organizations? You know, if PIA is to be able to provide information updates or be leveraged for existing process maps, it has to have some knowledge of the information that's in your repository. And today it does not, right? And so we have to think about, how do we actually, roll out technology, right, that is secure, alleviates organizational privacy concerns, adhere to GDPR and other regulations. And so, we're thinking through, how do we do that? Now, the great news is architecturally we can support it, right? And we also have, kind of in mind a PIA model that includes customer specific fine tuning in the future, which means we can make PIA aware of the content in your repository. Then at some point, I think, yes, PIA can help keep your content updated. Because when we think about generative AI, this is really important. It's not just about getting information in. This is just really kind of the tip of the spear and what we can do. Like, what was the one thing that we could do right now to give our customers value in their organizations? And it really was simple and straightforward. Let other people contribute, right? Let other people add value in help kind of that process discovery. From there, obviously, we want to make the refinements to where the assets that are created under that are a little bit easier to work with. And when we get to, kind of the what's next roadmap piece, we'll talk a little bit more about some decisions that we're making in this space. But yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So we've got a couple more questions that have come in. So how can PIA be used to incorporate appropriate frameworks such as NIST and CIS controls into the processes it's creating?
Yes. Generative AI has some loose concepts of these frameworks, right? Because they have access to large swaths of information, they have access. So it becomes, how do we take that? It does not do that today, right? It does not adhere to a particular framework unless you are prompting it, and what it creates initially is somewhat aligned. But we think about, for example, order to cache APQC process, right? We can construct it in a manner that adheres to APQC as far as like the information. But I don't think right now, right, that you would be able to have your diagrams in that architecture, kind of fully align. Because again, PIA is not aware of what's in the repository, right? The moment that PIA is aware in the repository and we fine tune PIA enough to know this is what we consider, kind of the 85% case of ideal APQC standard for, order to cache, then we can start to uncover some of those gaps and those insights. That's absolutely, kind of part of kind of the future vision is not just getting content in, but helping you keep your content updated in a compliant way, right? Where it's not, maybe you have, risks associated with your processes without mitigating controls. You want to know this, right? And PIA can inform you of this, once it's become aware of the data and information in your repository.
Okay, thank you, Ira. So next question, is it possible to train PIA on custom process diagram design that orient in BPMN 2.0 but differ from it? So this person has a wiki in Confluence where they describe their own BPMN design. Is it possible for PIA to read that and design the diagrams according to it?
Not today, certainly in the future, right? That's part of kind of that fine tuning in alignment with kind of higher level standards. The other thing that we have to be careful of as we explore generative AI technology is that, in our customers' world, being wrong is somewhat unacceptable, right? So we've got to make sure that as we leverage this to provide these organizational insights, that the level of confidence of what we're providing is high. And so it will take training on specific customer data, to get that answer and confidence level higher.
Okay, and we've got one more, and I think you'll like this one, Ira. So, in order to optimize a process, could we share with Pia the current process steps and ask it to identify improvement opportunities?
You can, however, it's not going to tell you the improvement opportunities. It's going to diagram them, right? So it's going to be a little bit about you're going to find out what it thinks the improvement is right now once it actually gives you the answer to your question, right? It's not going to segment it. And I think that that is a perfect segue into the roadmap and our plans, because I think the questions are starting to, starting to guide me right into, what we're doing next and what our plans are for PIA. So let's talk a little bit more about what's actually next, and what are we thinking from a PIA generative AI, kind of roadmap perspective and some of the problems that we want to solve. So right now, you can use conversational interface and you can upload SOP documents to create diagrams. The diagrams adhere to a level of complexity before you start to get into kind of the staircase. We're actually taking a look at that now. What engine updates can we make to actually enhance the fidelity and the one-to-one of what's actually happening? So that's one thing. What we're thinking about really next is really around two different areas. We do see a lot of value in PIA being able to connect to the business architecture, establish the relationships that are established in the SOP. The idea is if you have an area of responsibility in an SOP and you have a resource that is in your repository, PIA should be able to automatically link that, therefore reducing again the amount of rework that needs to happen, when these initial diagrams are created. However, we've been hearing from customers in the market, right, that yeah, that sounds great, but I already have a lot of data. And can you give me more insights on the data that I have? So we're really thinking to make a little bit more of a pivot around like the idea of how do we give you more information based on the information that you have in your repository. So, one thing is the ability to just ask PIA questions and get information out about the information that you have. We've talked about previously, and one of the things that we're working on is replacing IQL with PIA, natural language, which is if you want to get reporting and information out of iGrafx right now, you have to leverage IQL. To do that, that's a higher technical barrier of entry. We really want to make it simple and easy because I don't think executives in the organization want to learn a query language to get the reports. And so we really see a lot of value there. We see a lot of value in being able to ask PIA questions like what was asked earlier. Hey, here's our process. Can you tell me some ideas for how we might improve it? So taking that, I did an iterative process to tell PIA what I did. I asked PIA what the ideal state is. What's the gaps? What's the difference? And is this something that we want to bring into kind of our process landscape and update? And then there's, simplify integration. We've heard from the market and customers, there's a lot of appetite to leverage PIA, with a broader ecosystem of data. And so, when you think about simplifying integrations, it's between our own products, other products. So if you can take natural language and you can actually use that to create an API call on the fly, that becomes extraordinarily powerful. So those are some near-term items, that we're thinking, from the roadmap perspective and/or working on. Some other things that I want to talk about, really is, what is the broader goal here? What are we, working towards in a more long-term way, right? This is really about helping customers get information into iGrafx. So I see a future where iGrafx, you point your structured and unstructured data in iGrafx. We leverage generative AI to basically create your repository. You could do that with aligned frameworks, templates, so your repository is populated, right? We see the time to value is a significant, kind of barrier in this space, right? Because transformation efforts sometimes are, they take years. And so if we can help get the seed of information in quickly, rationalize that, and then start to provide you insights and reporting, We think that that's enormously powerful. And then it becomes, we do know a lot about process. We've been in business a really long time. We've worked with, many and hundreds of very large multinational corporations around process. We ought to be able to take that to help you start to improve your process based on that foundational knowledge, leveraging generative AI to do that. So what you saw today, this is just like the first, release essentially of PIA and what its capabilities are. It is focused on the getting information in, but we are thinking about getting information out, operational intelligence from your processes. That was a lot. Happy to answer more questions for folks.
Hey, Ira, so we have one more question in the Q&A. So on comparing the process to the ideal process for process improvement, how broad and deep is PIA's subject matter expertise?
I would say right now it's broad. It is not deep. And I think deep requires fine tuning. Deep requires access and knowledge of information PIA doesn't have access to yet. So I think in general, PIA is probably going to know right now a more efficient way to execute a process, right, than a human being, probably, based on its foundational knowledge. But it's not going to be organizationally aware, which is somewhat of a challenge, right? Because you can take the same process and it's slightly varied and implemented for valid business reasons, right? And we need to be able to account for that.
Brilliant, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone else has any questions, be sure to just put them in the Q&A. We have a few more minutes, so.
Yeah, and I really want to reiterate, yes, there is a lot of value that generative AI technology and PIA brings in the future, but I want to reiterate today, you can leverage this to get people in your organization contributing. In this, I can tell you in 6 years of working with customers in this market, that's the significant barrier. These tools in this space have long been thought of as too complex to use for non-technical users. And so a lot of the work funnels into, kind of your process orgs. And so being able to just get folks contributing, and it's not one-to-one, it's not perfect, right? But it's getting them involved in the process in a manner that's actually creating assets and getting that review and that governance process going.
Yeah. Okay, so one more question. I think this is a great question to speak more about what Process 360 Live can do.
Mm-hmm.
So once processes are created for different teams, how can they be connected to build a picture of the interconnected processes in the enterprise? So how can we connect everything together?
Yeah. So how we connect everything together, I don't think it's necessarily like a generative AI question in general. I think it's a Process 360 Live kind of question. So if we think about kind of how iGrafx thinks about process, right? We've got this discover pillar, which is, we need to be able to know what activities, what processes are taking place. There's a systems view of that, which is, I have minds data, system data, documentation, and then there's the human component of that. And we really think it's extraordinarily important that you have both of those contributing to the process landscape. If you're just mining data, you're not getting all the information you need. If people are just, pulling out of their heads and documenting what they're doing, you're not getting all of the information. So it's really about discovering process and doing that piece. That's a combination of process mining, task mining. That's a combination of, process documentation, using PIA to get that information in. And then it's about, keeping that information updated and ensuring that you've got compliance and governance, right? It's about risk reduction at this point to a degree. And it's saying, hey, we need to keep these updated. Now, we've talked about it, right? You want to improve a process. You can mine the process to understand what's happening, document it. Then you can kind of take a look at it and say, we think based on this mined information, for example, that, this activity takes too long. Why? So you can actually do that. you could run simulation and do a what if analysis. If you make changes related to, kind of that underlying process, what are the downstream impacts? What are the improvements that you get? And then you actually implement those improvements, right? And then you combine it again to say, hey, are we actually seeing the real world benefit of the changes that we've made? So this is about reducing risk, reducing cost, reducing time in Process 360 Live, in kind of that discover, design, optimize approach. We think is the more holistic way to do this.
That's a great overview. So we've got time for one more question. We've got one more in the box. Let's assume that I have a list of problems or issues with respect to a current process. Will Pia eventually be able to take these issues into account when designing and suggesting an improved process?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing is Pia has to have the information aware that that's the challenge, right? And so if that's documented as metadata anywhere, kind of in your repository that will be picked up, absolutely it should be able to do that in the future.
Brilliant. And there is just one more, which I think rounds it up really nicely. So when is Pia available, and will it be an upgrade with cost?
So Pia is available right now. Now there is Pia, which is the natural language inputs available today in Process 360 Live. You can go use this now. There is the SOP document upload, which is Pia Plus. That would be, speaking with your account manager to talk about how to enable that for you.
Wonderful. I think
Yeah.
that's all the questions. Thank you, Ira.
Yeah, but I do want to say the little cheat in the little, you certainly, it is much easier for somebody to take a document, upload it, and generate the content, but you can actually just copy and paste the information from a document into the window and achieve similar results. And we get a lot of questions. I just want to address this around, hey, what's like the character limit for the conversation? It's into the thousands of pages. So I mean, you could literally select all on a document, paste that conversation in, and there's a good chance that you're going to get a nice representative sample of what was in that document.
Yeah. Great. I think that's it for questions, Ira. I'll let you finish up.
Great. Well, I appreciate everybody joining today. I do want to say that this is an interactive process with customers, with the market. I want to continue this conversation. I don't want a webinar to be the only place that we actually talk about this potential here. We're very much in a discovery phase for solving problems for customers specifically, and really in that prioritization to say, hey, what's the next thing that we can focus on to add the most amount of value? So I want to encourage everyone here, if you have a question that you didn't get to ask, if you think of something when this webinar is over, please reach out to me directly. If you're interested in leveraging Pia, talk to your account executive or send in an email to info about getting started. I think that that's an amazing way to open up this to your organization and allow them to be able to contribute. It does, in fact, save a lot of time in taking somebody who doesn't know how to do this to create an actual artifact that can then be worked on. So I encourage folks to try it out. I encourage you, if you have any questions, to reach out to me directly. Happy to engage and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Ira, for the excellent presentation on Pia.